Hello and welcome to today's webinar. This is a Washington, D.C. update. We'll be covering federal government policy on COVID and on a range of other topics. This is a webinar produced by the National Tooling and Machining Association and the Precision Metal Forming Association. I am Caitlin Sickles. I'm a principal in the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell. We do the media relations, public relations efforts for NTMA and PMA. Joining me on today's webinar is Paul Nathanson, also from PRG at Bracewell, and the guys from the Franklin Partnership. That's your on-the-ground government relations firm in Washington, D.C. That's Omar Nashashibi and John Guzik. As I said at the top, we are covering a wide range of issues. If you haven't joined these webinars in the past, they've been going on now actually for a few years. They started as a way for us to fill members in on what was going on from a federal government perspective with COVID. But since then, they've shifted to include not just COVID, but a wide range of other federal policy issues. On today's webinar, we'll be covering a number of new regulations, as well as an update on what some people call China bill or competition and supply chain bill. So we'll be covering those things. If you're looking for a copy of today's webinar, or you want to listen again or share it with a friend, you can find this webinar on onevoiceinfo.org. onevoiceinfo.org. You can find this webinar as well as all of the webinars that we have done. All of those are available there, as well as a number of resources that we will discuss. You can also get more from us every other week on our podcast. That's our Talking with One Voice. You can find it wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll give a little promo for that at the end as well. So with all of those housekeeping notes, I'm going to go ahead and kick off the webinar. I want to start with recent regulatory actions. John Guzik over at Franklin Partnership, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Caitlin. We've been mentioning the last few webinars and certainly on our Monday morning phone calls that OSHA is looking at establishing a heat rule, where they would establish a rule that when the heat index exceeds a certain number, and their talk is 80 degrees, that they would implement a rule. They've already established a national emphasis plan. Here on this slide, the CDC has put together a heat tracker. This slide is updated daily. It'll indicate how many emergency room visits have been reported due to a heat injury. This data is updated daily by the CDC. Also, this map is also color coordinated, so you get an idea of what the temperature is like in any part of the country on any given day.
So, John, I think this is one of those examples of, we now know, you just mentioned rightly the National Emphasis Program that's been in effect since April 8th by OSHA. We now know that OSHA itself has this access to this map, as you obviously do. So OSHA is making heat, as John said, an emphasis part of their inspection. So if they do have either a regularly scheduled inspection or a new surprise one, they are going to be looking at heat. And so obviously, if you're in one of these areas, OSHA is going to be looking extra closely there. So I think, John, that's an excellent way to lay it out.
On this next slide, OSHA it has established a website specifically on heat. And then onto that next slide, there's just additional information for employees and your workers. For example, ways to protect yourself and your co-workers. 3 out of the 4 heat fatalities occur typically in the first week that somebody's new on the job. And so this page, start slowly. Use the 80-20, 20% rule. For your first week, your first day on the job, do 20% of your full intensity and work up from there. Build up your intensity.
Yeah, I think that's right. So with the way I would translate this, exactly those points that John just mentioned, if you do have a recordable due to heat this summer, OSHA is probably going to come back and ask, what did you do? How was your response? And even if you don't have an incident, we do know that they're going to ask for your manual. Are some of these things, what parameters do you have there? What kind of emergency responses, especially zero buddy system, you have to monitor others. These are things that OSHA is going to continue to ask. And as you can see, if a worker is experiencing a headache or nausea, weakness or dizziness, heavy sweating, etc., then take these actions as a symptom response. So that's why we think it's important to use this also in the context of not just how hot it is outside, but we have to think of it in the context of our indoor workspaces with regards to the OSHA emphasis program. And on this website that John alluded to, those were the previous images, but we have the link down here at the bottom. And these are literally what they say, the employer's responsibility. That's the subtitle of that section here that we just copied and pasted to give you an idea of some of the areas that they want to see the employer place an emphasis upon. And so all of those, if you go to that bottom link that we have on employer responsibility, it'll take you directly to that page. And we strongly suggest many of you have somebody in your shop take a look at that, because John, they're analyzing those heat comments. You were on that hearing when 3,000 people listening in. There was a lot calling for some kind of a rule to take effect.
Yeah, you and I were on this 5-hour hearing that OSHA put on, and it was a listening session, and Omar testified there. But I was amazed at how many small little fringe organizations came out in support of this heat index rule. There's very few what I would call industry or businesses or manufacturers that participated in that hearing who were expressing concerns and how that a heat index rule you should take into consideration not only geography but indoor versus outdoor, and so to make sure that they, as they craft the rule, that they take into consideration. A one size fits all probably is not going to work for a heat rule, but that's not what the proponents of the heat rule were saying. So
yeah, and what you're seeing on this slide, and you're going to see this format here for a little bit as we run through the next coming regulatory issues that we see. But this is the agenda that the government puts out and says, what are the timelines for upcoming regulations? And right now, OSHA says they're in the middle of analyzing the previous comments. And once they're done with this analyzing period, then they start moving towards those next steps. And we do know that they actively have a working group, an ICOSH working group that's been talking to industry and trying to see what they can do in the next steps. But I mentioned the future regulatory activity. John and I are going to run through a few regulations that we think that are important to manufacturers. We've got a long list of 30+ pages that we just went through. The federal government is required twice a year to release what's called the Unified Regulatory Semi-Annual Agenda. In that semi-annual agenda, federal agencies from DOD to EPA to the Railroad Administration folks, they all have to provide the White House with a list of all the regulations, rules, and notices of substance that they're going to issue or release in about the coming 12 months. So what we do is we go through every single agency and identify the ones that we think are of most interest, because it's really important to help, not just from us as lobbyists, but you as manufacturers to get a better sense of the activity that is going to potentially be regulated, what steps that you need to take now, and what potentially steps you need to take later. But John, this one shouldn't be much of a surprise since it really got started back in the Obama era on the injury illness reporting rule, and we're already seeing some pretty quick activity on it.
Yes, and one more thing on the big general point I want to point out. Many people would say, well, is this new with the Biden administration? This has been in effect since 1978. That every administration since 1978 is putting together this regulatory agenda. So this is not a new thing moving forward. So we do want to point out that that the injury and illness report, a new proposed rule is expected sometime in December. Currently, most employees are required to fill out their 300A and file electronically, but under this proposed rule, they want to expand the reporting requirements so that many employers would be required to submit their 300 and 301. Now, those are more specific injury logs, and so the 300 is more general. The 301 is more specific, and again, it would be submitted electronically. How private is this information? That's the concern. And just because you're reporting an injury or illness doesn't mean you're increasing safety. So, but they're going through this process, and we do expect some sort of rule in December.
That's right, and they've already put out the proposed rule on it. There's a comment period that's closing on the 30th, so next week, and One Voice is filing comments on that, opposing this rule to exactly John's point that this is not going to improve the safety. And this rule, though, would apply to those with 100 or more employees, whereas Obama's effort was at 250 or more. So this would expand and hit a higher class that's there as well. Lockout tagout, this is another area that has been ongoing for a number of years. We did file comments during the request for information period a couple of summers ago in August of 2019 in response to Department of Labor. This is the control of hazardous energy, what we call uncontrolled hazardous energy, and I think the Kershaw Amendment in process that's in there. So this is something that we do believe they'll continue to explore, and understanding, for those of you that aren't familiar, when you're doing, let's say, a tooling change, die change, they believe, some of them believe, that you want a complete shut off, unplugging, virtually, literally unplugging. And so that's what this one looks at. And we again expect this now to come up in March of 2023. John, but the joint employer one, this is definitely something we think is going to be high on the union agenda.
Yeah, there's a number of rules that we're going to go through in this list. Joint employer was a controversial rule and decision that was made during the Trump administration. It was overturned, and now the Biden administration is overturning that. So what we definitely see from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, the Trump administration looked at the semi-annual report of regulations, and they were, Omar, it's the term, tearing down, repealing regulations, and this administration is moving forward, reinstating what the previous administration, was trying to, regulations that they were trying to repeal. And joint employer is one of those rules.
It is, and this is one to be considering if you have any temporary staff. So if you're using a temp agency or a staffing agency for employees rather, and you have to determine who is the actual employer for purposes of OSHA implementation and safety. And there's a number of requirements that are already in place, and that's coming out next month. There's also another one on union elections. What this deals with is something called union blocking. Again, John made an excellent point on Trump basically removing and making changes, and now they're just trying to reverse some of them. This is one of those. The Trump administration implemented something called blocking, where it was making it easier basically for unions to decertify. And this is now to make it harder for unions to decertify in the election process. So that's something else that we expect them to move on here coming up in September of 2022. And then John, again, over at CEQ on the NEPA, that's been a top priority because Trump was trying to use it to expedite infrastructure projects, but this reversal might have the effect of slowing them down.
Yes, and the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, is depending on what perspective you're coming from, it's either something that's going to protect our environment or is going to slow down economic activity. And NEPA investigations can take years and years and years, and then once a decision is made, it is often challenged in court. And so to make it harder, as Omar correctly pointed out, the Trump administration wanted to ease some of these NEPA regulations, to expand economic activity, infrastructure and such. Now this administration is trying to make it difficult, make it more challenging, or make it harder to implement some of these recommendations. And so stay tuned.
Yeah, exactly. And it's obviously the irony there is on one side, they're trying to increase infrastructure investment through the big law that was just signed last November, but there's also the environmental aspect of it. And that's what we're seeing here. Another EPA regulation, or that was CEQ, this is EPA on particulate matter. Air quality is coming up with an NPRM, means a notice of proposed rulemaking. And so what they do is they issue a proposed rule, and then they issue that final rule. And the proposed rule is already is coming out here. The notice of proposed rulemaking is going to be August of 2022. And what this does is it regulates everything from the soot in the air to the different under the National Ambient Air Quality Standards in an object of protecting public health. So this could add economic restrictions in certain areas, and they actually go by the county level in determining whether or not to impose additional economic restrictions that are on there. Those are just a sample of some of them coming out of EPA and OSHA, but I mean, John, this is a recurring theme. We're going back and forth between Trump and Biden because we've got the final rule coming out here on the IRAPs and officially putting a stake in that and their new ideas of where they want to go with apprenticeships.
Contrary to what I just said, where the Trump administration was tearing down regulations, the Trump administration was implementing the IRAP program for apprenticeships. And then when Biden got sworn into office, shortly after being sworn into office, through an executive order, he canceled any future development of the IRAP program. However, this proposed rule, but he kept IRAPs in play. He did not cancel the IRAPs that were already being implemented. And so what this proposed rule is going to do, it's going to basically, as you said, put a stake into the heart of the IRAP program, so that no future IRAPs could be put forth.
Yeah, but we should see activity, and obviously, let's just say what this is. This is a union issue. The unions really didn't like the IRAPs because they see their apprenticeships programs as being a source of revenue, and the IRAPs then that would be run by industry, they saw that as a threat to their system and source of revenue, and that's just plainly candid what that ended up happening there. And there's some accountability and auditing issues as well, but the real thing was on unions. Two others that we'll just round out here on the regulatory side quickly. We've got an IRS notice coming out on 199A. That's the domestic production activities deduction, more or less. That's the phrase that they use for it these days. And this, a lot of our members claim this, roughly about half of our members do, based on our annual survey. And what it's going to do is change some of the allowance and the calculations that they deal with on the proposed regulation to provide additional guidance on the reporting requirements for pass-through entities. And that's why this 199A is so important, especially since we've got a number of our companies increasingly have small business trusts for passing it down. And that new rule for the 199A that hopefully your accountants will flag for you will be in December of 2022. One issue before I just start to round it up, John, if I could quickly, this is one that we'd heard quite a bit, especially from some NTMA members. So if you're a defense contractor, this slide and the next slide are going to be really for you or a government contractor of any kind. Prompt payment of contractors. About 2 summers ago or so, we got an email or got contacted by an NTMA member, and they were saying we increasingly feel like the primes are using us as their banks, and that brought flashbacks to when John and I were working on the auto issue, where we're tier ones and the OEMs and the PPAP system. And there's an issue with prompt payment. Now, we talked to the Small Business Committee on the Senate side, and the staffer then, she told us that this is definitely on their radar screen. They're working on language, and that August, they were supposed to include a fix to force prompt payment. Now, here's what you're seeing is they're going to get the Department of Defense is finally moving forward with implementing this on the subcontractor and accelerating payments to small businesses, both primes and subs, and that's going to be December of 2022. So thank you to those members that reached out to us on an issue we hadn't heard about before. Hopefully, if it doesn't fix it, it'll at least make things a little bit better. And then lastly, before I turn it over to John to kick us off on the supply chains area, the DoD NIST cybersecurity rule, another one. We've had members from both associations reach out to us on this. I know there's been webinars, there's been speeches at conferences on cybersecurity. When you ask us what are the top 10 things to worry about for manufacturing cyber in the next 10 years, cyber is number 5 or in the top 5. We strongly advise taking a look at the NIST action. We've talked about CMMC 1.0 and 2.0 that are coming out. They're now moving forward with fully going with the NIST directive that Obama started and Trump put in place in 2017. So in December of 2022, you're going to see some additional action from DoD on the cybersecurity requirements, which is going to be very important for not just the DoD contractors, but also for general government and ultimately publicly traded companies we increasingly see are using this. But John, do you want to go ahead and give us, let's get us started. Where are we on the Hill and what's going on in supply chains?
Yeah, they're Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate, are stumbling over each other to try to address the manufacturing supply chain issue. Parties and the parties and the institutions, the chambers, have different solutions to do it. Both the House and the Senate have passed a China competition bill that we've brought up.
I don't know. John just might have. You there, John?
Yep.
All right, go ahead.
Yes. Yep, go ahead.
No, I just heard some noise, so please continue your thought.
It's just that the Congress is negotiating differences between the House and Senate bill that we will talk about in a little bit, but know that both parties have a vested interest in getting tough with China and passing a strong competition bill.
Yeah, exactly. And as we go through, just a couple things we wanted to throw out there. John and I are big believers in data, and we read a lot. This is interesting. Came out from the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas with the oil and gas. Obviously, the price at the pump, although one of our locals just dropped to $4.99, and I can't believe we celebrated, but we did. And now you look at what are some of the challenges for oil and gas firms as they seek to ramp up. This was a chart that we just saw recently. We just thought it might be of interest to the group here. And you just take a look at some of the stats that are on here on the shortages of the supply chains with these 132 executives from oil and gas firms responded to a survey just last week on the shortages they have. Steel tubular goods, that's always an issue, but you're seeing that significant shortages are at 51% right now. Equipment shortages are hovering at about 70 or 80%. And there's quite a bit looking at sand, the other inputs. So if you're looking at fracking right there, another area of 64%, 65% are facing some kind of shortages. Personnel, you're dealing with that as well. And on chemicals, what's not on this slide, there's a couple of things. 2/3 of them, of these oil and gas executives in this survey to the Fed, expect it'll take more than a year to resolve supply chains. Further, 33% said it would take 4 to 6 months to drill and complete an additional well beyond current plan. So 33% say 4 to 6 months. Then 24% said it'll take 7 to 9 months, with another quarter saying 10 to 12 months. So as you're looking for immediate relief, and I know John, he's doing the calculations from the November 1st election on when new relief at the pump might come. But folks, based on those numbers, it's not going to be anytime soon. A couple other things.
Go ahead, this slide is interesting as well. Again, Omar and I are hogs for data, and this is an analysis of the top 100 Chinese companies. And we hear a lot about state-owned enterprises, but then this chart shows, since 2010, the number of the top 100 companies in China, how many are state-owned, operated, how many are mixed, and how many are non-public. And what we see here, the non-public is I think the white slide. The white is you're seeing an increase number of non-public companies in China of that top 100, and the number of state-owned enterprises going down.
Yeah, you did. And then unfortunately we saw under COVID now that trend getting reversed. And in large part, I don't want to speculate, but I can assume what types of companies that are state-owned that are increasingly the ones being put out there. And the reason that this is important in the context of trade and enforcing trade against China is because the Trump administration launched a Section 301 investigation based on intellectual property theft and forced technology transfer. The Biden administration is considering filing a 301, a separate investigation against China to apply potentially tariffs under the reasons for state-owned enterprises and illegal government subsidies to manufacturing businesses. That is exactly what we have been talking about for quite a number of years, going on, unfortunately, now 20 years, with regards to the subsidies and the SOEs. But this chart really, to John's point, exemplifies that, which is why, John, I think there's so much, I'm not going to use the word momentum, but going back to where you started, there is significant support for moving a bill on China and competition, but is there momentum?
Just to refresh, the Senate passed a bipartisan bill with 16 Republicans voting for their bill called USICA. The House passed a very partisan party line vote bill, both addressing the China issue. It's politically very popular to do China bashing, and so they had to work out their differences. The House and Senate put together a traditional conference committee. 108, 109 senators and members of Congress were on that committee. They tried to negotiate the differences within this group of 108. Those negotiations have gone very, very slowly. And so we're just seeing in the past week that the leadership, the bipartisan leadership in the House and the Senate are starting to take control of the negotiations. So we're still lobbying to make sure that the Jobs Act, providing short-term Pell Grants for short-term training, and the Career Technical and the College Transparency Act is included. There is a very controversial trade section in the Senate passed bill that would automatically reinstate, for example, reinstate exclusions that had already expired. That is controversial. Many people believe that you got an exclusion because you had a hard time getting the product in. You've had a year to find domestic sourcing. There's a number of, because of COVID, because of the slowdown in the economy, there's capacity, there's extra capacity in this country, and so we shouldn't automatically approve an exclusion process moving forward. And so these are some of the differences that the House and Senate are trying to work out. The goal was to get it agreed to before the July 4th recess. Well, that's today. I don't think it's not going to happen today. The real goal is to get this onto the president's desk before the Congress breaks for their August recess. Intel made an announcement just this week, or maybe today, that they were going to slow down or wait and see on the production of this new chip factory that they're trying to build in Ohio because of the uncertainty. In this China bill, there's one area that parties in both chambers agree, and that is the money to put forth to invest in the domestic semiconductor chip industry.
Yeah, I think that's right. So starting at the bottom of that slide, the way this bill passes by they get rid of provisions that can get 60 votes over in the Senate, and that's what they started to do. The big four of leadership met, and so they've knocked out the union provisions, they've knocked out the climate change provisions, they removed the Cannabis Safe Banking Act language that was in there in one chamber. So they've started to whittle this thing down, and then yesterday, being Thursday, June 23rd, the top trade folks met. So we know Wyden and Richie Neal met. And so they started to figure out, to John's point, what is doable in that trade section or not. One other area we wanted to touch on, we've been getting a number of questions here for our shop from a number of groups, both on this call and off, is with regards to the research and tax credit and what's happening there. You all know a couple of things. We've been sending out action alerts. And by the way, you're going to get an action alert on Tuesday. Please push it out and to include the Jobs Act and College Transparency Act in the China bill. So please, when that comes to your inbox on Tuesday, send your note to the members, as we need to get that through. But one thing we were trying to add was to fix for the research and development tax credit. As you recall, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, what it did is, in order to move some money around, they allowed for full and extension of immediate expensing for the R&D tax credit through 2021, and then had it amortized over 5 years starting in 2022. Now, with the starting of the amortization is now underway as we get into the summer months, that obviously is causing a lot of challenges for our members and what they should be trying to do. So we try to include the research and development tax credit in the final package. We succeeded in the House, providing a 4-year extension and a delay of the amortization retroactive to January 1st. So we passed that in the House. We're having challenges in the Senate because Democrats want to insist on an extension of the expired child tax credit. And they're saying that we're not going to allow any corporate tax provisions to move forward until the CTC is also permitted to move forward. And that's been the major hang up there. I mean, John, my sense is at this point, based on conversations, we are focusing on the year-end bill. While we're still trying to get R&D in here, we're hearing there will not be a tax title in the China competition bill, which means we have to work on the year-end tax extenders bill and hopefully make this retroactive.
As you correctly pointed out, the leaders who are trying to negotiate this China bill, they're knocking things out. They're not adding new things. And so I agree with you that it's unlikely to be included in the China competition bill, but there's a number of expiring tax provisions, including the R&D tax credit, that Congress needs to address. And typically we see these tax extenders passed in a lame duck session. We expect that would be that year-end tax bill that you referenced that will be done after the election.
Right, but that wreaks havoc on everybody trying to deal with their accounting and also their budgeting, frankly, because amortization is very different than in full immediate expensing under Section 174. But right now, that we're just trying to give you our best political assessment of where we think things stand. And so typically you're going to think that year-end tax extenders bill, that usually will move around the second week in December. So they will be cutting it close if and when they do get to that legislation, because they also have to deal with the EBITDA depreciation, the 30% that you can claim, since depreciation and amortization part of EBITDA is no longer in effect as of January 1st for that 30% calculation, which also does a hit to a number of our members that are out there. But quickly, let's just jump right into trade as we get ready to wrap up. We wanted to bring you back to these charts again, and we're going to bring in our friends from Bracewell here as well to talk about some of the work they've done on the exclusion process and comments. But the Commerce Department's not finished on the Section 232 steel and aluminum process. As you know by now, there is a way to petition the Commerce Department for you, your own company, to not pay tariffs on a specific steel product or aluminum, and you can do that. They've constantly been changing the rules. Looks like in September of 2022, they're going to do another round of changes to that, which is good, since the coalition that Bracewell runs has been putting out some good information and comments and feedback to the Department of Commerce on that. This is kind of a be still my heart moment. No, they're not initiating the termination of the Section 232 tariffs through this government regulation, but what they are doing is coming up with a process, because this is a law that had been used, I think, 5 times since 1962, so it wasn't exactly used very often. And again, it's national security, Paul. So this is really for them to start telling us how they could end the tariffs. It doesn't mean, Paul, they're going to end the tariffs.
I guess it's a good sign that at least somebody's thinking about the end of the tariffs, but there still is no indication that the Biden administration is seriously considering ending the Section 232 tariffs. And as we have talked about, unlike previous tariffs that were used, the 201 tariffs back in 2002, there's no end dates for these 232 tariffs. So that's why we have to keep working. We do have an opportunity this coming up this summer. As we talked about during the last, I believe the last webinar, Congress directed the International Trade Commission to do an investigation about the impact of the 232 tariffs as well as the 301s on the U.S. economy and manufacturers. So we have reached out to some of you, and we welcome folks who want to testify at that hearing. The good news is that that hearing is virtual, so you can do it in the comforts of your own home. We just have to submit a letter by July 6th. The hearing is on July 21st. You would get, they started out saying 10 minutes, Omar, but I don't think it's going to be 10 minutes. I think by the time that they get so many folks who want to appear, it'll be about 4 minutes or 3 minutes. But we view this as a great opportunity to highlight the problems with the 232 and also continue to pressure the administration to show more flexibility when it comes to removing these tariffs on our close trading allies. As you can see, prices have taken a little bit of a dip, but the U.S. Is still leading the world in aluminum prices. And on the next slide, you'll see on steel prices also have softened a little bit, although the blue line there, the light blue line, are U.S. prices. We continue to pay more, significantly more than the rest of the world. And as I don't have to tell you that one of the real issues is not being able to find the steel that you need, and lead times continue to be a problem. We will be sending out a survey, a short survey that we would like to use as part of our testimony to the ITC regarding lead time, steel supply, aluminum supply, and just get some updated information about what you're experiencing firsthand, because I think it's very important for the ITC to know. We also have a good line into the Commerce Department as far as the exclusion process, so we continue to want to hear about any issues you have with the exclusion process. We have heard about the objections from the steel producers that they object, they're gaming the system, and then they can't produce the steel that you need, even though they say they do in their objections. So we want to hear those kind of stories, and we can convey them to the Commerce Department.
I can chime in here on media efforts. We talked about at the top that a lot of the work that we do on the public relations side is really to amplify the work of your on-the-ground government relations team and sharing what's happening in the industry. This is a great story. Features Doug Johnson and Marion Manufacturing from the Washington Post. The story is a feature, as you can see, talking about the resilience in the economy despite mounting recession fears. And really what it points to is that while there is much media coverage about concern in business and industry about a recession, we're seeing a strength in the manufacturing sector continuing to perform well, and individual companies really excelling. There's some great quotes in here from Doug and pictures as well. So this is an important story, not just because it's great coverage for Doug, for PMA, for One Voice, but really it's important because it tells a story that members of Congress need to hear. It's an important perspective for media and for the people who make the policies that impact business. So it's a really good example, and we wanted to share it here so that folks would know about this recent coverage.
Yeah, and we also understand that not all sectors, if you're serving the auto sector, you certainly have a different experience. I'm looking at a chart of all the shutdowns that the automakers are scheduled for the summer. So, but it is important that there's a better understanding of what's happening in the manufacturing sector, and that those providing capital equipment and other sectors are doing well. And really, it all comes back down to if you can get the supply including steel and other metals, then you can provide the products that are needed. So great job by Marion Manufacturing. And we always get to have these opportunities for NTMA and PMA members with the media. And just a reminder, we would never, if you're interested in volunteering to talk to the media, you'd fill out a form that both NTMA and PMA have. And then we would never put you on with a reporter unless you want to be put on. And we're always happy to go through a little training, but it's great. It really is important for our advocacy efforts. And in addition, as in this case with the Washington Post, it's a nice little advertisement for you, all the good things that your companies are doing. Go ahead, Caitlin. Sorry to interrupt.
No, I think that's a really good point, that there's nuance, right, to the industry, that the industry isn't a monolith. There's different experiences depending on what sector you're in. And that is important context, for us to share with media and with policy makers. Another flag here, another little promo as we did up at the top for the Talking with One Voice podcast. You can find it wherever you get podcasts, on Apple, Google, wherever you download the shows that you listen to. Subscribe, rate it, review it, help other people find the show. It's a lot like what we talk about on the webinar, but there's a little more politics, a little more discussion of the horse race that is politics. So do check it out, and tell other people about it as well.
Yep, and John, there's always ways they can continue to support and donate.
And that would be, if you like the content that we have continued to provide throughout this pandemic for the past 2.5 years. Many of you on this call have already given generously to the NTMA GAF, their Government Affairs Fund, and then the PMA's Advocacy Fund. These are corporate contributions. And so if you want this content to continue, we hope you would give generously to both of those two funds. And keep in mind, this is corporate contributions, not personal contribution. You could make a personal contribution, but it's created for corporate contributions.
Yep, with that, we try to keep these about 35 minutes or so. We're happy to take any questions, and if there are any, or you can always reach out to us with this contact information, or to Bill Padnos of NTMA and Christy Carmigiano with PMA. Not seeing any questions. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We will be doing another webinar in July, and stay tuned for those additional details for registration, and hope you enjoy your weekend.